So often when examining the Dallas Cowboys' first round selection of the '94 draft, people tend to view it from the standpoint of a finished product. That is to say that they start with the selection itself, which in this case was defensive end Shante Carver from Arizona State, and they work from there in telling the story. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that process, but today I'm going to focus primarily upon how that selection ever came to be. Because if you were to ask me to explain the '94 draft for the Dallas Cowboys, whether it be on simply a first-round selection basis or on the draft class as a whole, it is through the process of it all where the vital truth can be found, where clarity for then and for future events is explained, at least on a very foundational level. The story of the 1994 draft for the Dallas Cowboys centers around Jerry Jones. And I know some of you may be listening and be like, oh no, Ryan, not another episode of Jerry bashing here, please. Well, I'm not going to bash Jerry here, at least not undeservedly so, but I am going to tell a story about Jerry. Actually, a series of stories about Jerry that have rarely been heard and that really need to be told in their proper context in order to understand the '94 draft. Because try as you might, you will never make sense of the 1994 draft for the Cowboys by minimizing the impact of Jerry Jones, because his fingerprints were everywhere. Alright, in April of '94, Jerry Jones had a one-track mind. He was laser-focused on proving himself to be the equal, if not the better, of Jimmy Johnson. Aside from winning back-to-back Super Bowls as the Cowboys head coach, Johnson had done what, to Jones's mind, must have been the unpardonable by becoming something of a wizard, both locally, nationally, and internationally. Everything Jimmy Johnson did seemingly turned to gold. Everything he said was revered as gospel truth. You know, by this time, Jimmy had his own book out. NFL Films was working on a documentary about Jimmy and the Cowboys, their worst to first turnaround. You know, his hair was always perfect. He always knew the right buttons to push to motivate his team. He could call his own shot in the dark and didn't blink an eye about a midweek prediction on live radio that his team would win the biggest game of the year over the 49ers. Jimmy knew how to get Jerry mad and how to put the owner back in his place. I mean, from the public perspective, what wasn't to like about this guy, right? Jerry was still jealous of Johnson's legend, and he was bent on doing anything within his power to destroy that legend. That meant the first thing Jerry had to do was discredit the chart. And in order to discredit the chart, it was necessary for Jerry to at least partially publicize it. The chart, at its most foundational level, was a product of a Jimmy Johnson brainwave that occurred about a week before the 1990 draft. Johnson was in a staff meeting, and he wondered aloud if there was a historical way to distinguish a good draft day trade from a bad one. Now, Vice President Mike McCoy at the time, who was the official numbers cruncher for the Cowboys back then, McCoy immediately went to work on the problem. 2 days later, after evaluating 3 years' worth of draft trades, I believe, he presented Jimmy Johnson with a chart that assigned values to every pick in the draft. From 1990 through 93, Johnson consulted this chart to make a total of 14 draft day trades. Not including players here, just draft day trades involving draft picks. And along the way, he produced some of the best draft classes in franchise history. Over the years, Johnson had been careful to keep this chart out of the public eye. But Jones, in the days leading up to the '94 draft, he went out of his way to make certain parts of it public knowledge. He talked about it with the press. He positioned the chart in a convenient place in the Cowboys' war room for ESPN cameras to catch. His reasoning was simple. "I think it's important for people to know," said Jerry Jones, "that we just haven't done things intuitively around here. It's always been done collectively. We've got historical reference, pretty good guidelines to keep us from making a big mistake." Now, Jerry was also of the opinion that since Dave Wanstead had taken knowledge of the chart with him to Chicago when he became the Bears head coach, and since Norv Turner did the same when he left Dallas to become the head coach of the Washington Redskins, that it was okay to make the secret of the chart known to the rest of the league. It wasn't really a secret, so why pretend that it was Jones's way of looking at it. When I hear this, I'm reminded of Tom Landry's Cowboys. Back in the early 60s, the Cowboys started using computers to help streamline the scouting process. And to accelerate this process, the Cowboys shared information with the 49ers and the Rams. Eventually, the 67 or 68, the Saints joined this little circle as well. Now, Tom Landry and Tex Schramm could have said, hey, the Rams and 49ers and Saints already know our secret, so why don't we just fill in the rest of the league of what we're doing? But no, they didn't do that. Instead, they hung on to their secret. A secret that Landry and Schramm and the Cowboys turned to their distinct advantage during the 60s. They hung on to the secret for as long as they could until the competition officially caught up with them in the early 70s. By then, basically every team had a computerized scouting database they were working from to aid in scouting efforts. So, for the better part of a decade, there were teams who knew the Cowboys were doing something different. Eventually, somebody figured out that particular something had to do with computers, but the competition basically had to figure everything out. They had to put all the pieces together on their own. Tom Landry wasn't going to spill the beans. Tex Schramm, if you know him, he wasn't going to cut his competitors a break. Which differs drastically from Jerry Jones's outlook in 1994. He figured that, hey, since the Redskins and Bears know our secret, why shouldn't everyone else know too? It doesn't matter. I think it goes without saying that a smart move would have been for the Cowboys to use their chart to beat out the remaining teams on draft day, the ignorant ones, and do this for as long as they could. That's competition. But no, Jerry was so intent on doing disservice to Johnson's reputation as a, quote, draft day wizard that he took away some of the advantages that the Cowboys had owned on draft day in recent seasons. Purely selfish here. Purely selfish. Team first with Jerry? I don't think so. Aside from basically defacement of the Jimmy legend, Jerry had to make some magic happen during the 94 draft. He had to prove himself to be the same type of wheeler and dealer as Jimmy. Somebody who, even against all odds, seemingly always wound up with the best player or the best overall draft day haul available. Jimmy was the one who miraculously got Emmitt Smith. Jimmy was the one who snatched up both Russell Maryland and Alvin Harper in the first round, and still got Leon Lett in the 7th round and Larry Brown in the 12th round. Jimmy was the guy who stacked a pair of draft selections in each of the first 3 rounds of the 92 draft, and wound up with the likes of Kevin Smith, Darren Woodson, Clayton Holmes, Robert Jones. And I think that pressure of matching up with Jimmy in this way was one goal that Jerry Jones got a little bit preoccupied with during the 94 draft, particularly in the efforts to trade Alvin Harper. The Cowboys, in the week leading up to the draft, they had a trade worked out that would have sent Harper to the Pittsburgh Steelers in exchange for a 1st and 3rd round picks. But I have never been able to find out why that deal never got done. Some have suggested that the Steelers simply wanted to wait until closer to the draft to do a deal, thereby giving them a bit more leverage, supposedly. I've come across a quote from Alvin Harper in which he said that the deal was agreed to, but the Steelers simply never faxed him a contract to sign. I don't know. I can't say for sure whether that's true or not, or that was simply Harper blowing smoke. Either way, that opportunity to trade Harper fell through. And then Jerry started talking with the Browns, who owned the pick 8 spots ahead of Pittsburgh at number 9. The plan was for the Cowboys to swap first-round draft picks with Cleveland in exchange for Harper. The Cowboys would then select either John Theory of Alcorn State or Jameer Miller of UCLA with the number 9 pick. And then I think Jerry got greedy a little bit. He worked out a trade with the Rams for the number 5 pick. Now, the deal actually happening was dependent upon another team outside of the top 5, trading up into the top 4 and grabbing Trent Dilfer, an event that never happened. So Jerry's dream of moving up to number 5 and taking Willie McGinnis of USC never became a reality. But that's not the bad part. The bad part, and it's something I'll never understand, is why Dallas didn't trade up to number 7 then when they had the chance, or go back to the Browns and trade up to number 9 in order to get John Theory or Jameer Miller. Instead, they just sat pat with a number 28 overall pick and waited for the early picks to play out. And in the end, they traded up 5 spots to number 23 in order to grab Shante Carver, a player that many scouts felt would still be available on the board in the 3rd round. And after taking Carver, Cowboy executives are taking the angle of, well, we didn't think Jameer Miller or John Theory were good enough to be that home run type of player. We never really considered settling for them. It was either Willie McGinnis or bust for us. We think Shante Carver has more upside than Theory or Jameer Miller anyway. Blah, 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 blah. Now I know some of that is just the usual blarney that teams spew forth after drafting someone. It's to be expected. I mean, you don't expect the Cowboys to just trash their new guy. Oh my goodness, I can't believe we had to settle for this. This Shante Carver dude, he's just trash. So I get it. Some of the talk is understandable, but there's also a lot of what was said in the aftermath of drafting Carver, which simply is not true. In the early preparations for the '94 draft, there were 3 top-notch defensive ends on everyone's draft boards: Willie McGinnis, John Theory, Jameer Miller. Based on simply watching game film from their college days, these 3 were graded fairly close. It was almost neck and neck here. McGinnis gained separation by having a great scouting combine, which made him almost a sure lock to be taken in the top 5 picks of the draft. John Theory, Jameer Miller, they stayed about the same projection. They were being predicted to go at the back half of the top 10. Now, this is a fact. Okay, this is a fact. Just days before the draft, the Cowboys were angling to draft Theory or Miller at number 9. They would have been happy to trade away Alvin Harper in order to wind up with one of those 2 defensive ends. But all of a sudden on draft morning, Theory and Miller supposedly aren't good enough. All of a sudden, Carver is supposed to have more of an upside than them at number 23. Keeping Alvin Harper and picking Carver, a player that wasn't expected to contribute any significant amount as a rookie, that was supposed to help the Cowboys win another Super Bowl '94, even though we didn't believe this earlier in the week. And I realize that hindsight is 20/20 here, but there were many signs that Shante Carver was something less than first-round material, even back then. Here's a guy in Carver who constantly struggled with a weight issue during his college career. He then shows up to the scouting combine 15 pounds overweight. His time in the 40-yard dash was noticeably slow, and several scouts said that despite all of Carver's 40-plus sacks in college at Arizona State, that he, even whether in college film or at the combine, that he lacked quickness. And yet, there are the Cowboys making comparisons of Shante Carver with Charles Haley, sounding confident like he was the number 2 defensive end on their board all along, which in reality, it wasn't the case at all. It was just ridiculous and a bad omen of things to come for the Cowboys on draft day in coming years. Jerry did all that work to trade Alvin Harper. Like Jimmy Johnson, he swung for the fences. But unlike Jimmy, Jerry didn't know when to fold his cards and settle, and wound up with nothing but Shante Carver, a player they could have had much later in the draft, a player they claimed to be a future star, a player that many other teams were fighting to stay clear of that early in the going. Just bad all around. If it was me, I would have signed off on the deal with the Rams at number 5, granted that they would follow through on the trade proposal that they had offered. If the Cowboys could move up to 5 and then trade a 3rd or 4th round pick to the Rams in exchange for Flipper Anderson, then yeah, do it. Done deal. Flipper Anderson, he wasn't the high jump artist that Alvin Harper was. Not even close. But he was still a big play guy who averaged around 20 yards per catch for his career, even though he was on a fading Rams team. It's hard to imagine that Flipper Anderson would be any less productive on a star-studded offense such as they had in Dallas in '94, with Troy Aikman throwing him passes. And yes, folks, in case there are any naysayers out there, Troy Aikman would have been a significant upgrade over Jim Everett for Flipper Anderson. I like Everett, but the comparison is not even close at this point of their careers. I'll do that trade in a heartbeat. Take Theory or Jameer Miller at number 5 and be perfectly happy. However, that wasn't good enough for Jerry. He wanted to be like Jimmy, but instead he just wound up looking like someone green at the game. If ever there was a mismanaged draft day situation in Cowboys history, this certainly was it. There was a lot of smoke from Cowboys headquarters leading up to this draft, and a lot of talk from Cowboys headquarters afterwards. But none of it could disguise the fact that Jerry Jones's first crack at imitating Jimmy Johnson was a dismal operation that just failed and flopped miserably. It looks awful today when looking back upon it, but the strange truth is that it didn't look much better back then when it happened.